So a few of the smaller bits on the 9th missions and rules today. Today we have details on numbers of detachments, combat patrol missions, and most interestingly, games are now permitted to be played on smaller tables as per the core rules. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. It's not quite as many bombshells today as there have been over the last couple of days, but still a fair bit more useful information on piecing together the ever-changing picture that is 9th edition 40k. Today we'll talk about those detachment sizes and the 4 sizes of games that we can play, talk about those reduced table sizes, and then take a look at Games Workshop's first previewed combat patrol mission and the philosophy behind it. So first up on the Warhammer community article today, we have details of how many detachments will be allowed at various different sizes of game. Previously in 8th edition, these were only guidelines for organised play. That means things like tournaments and events and things, although in general play most people I find did tend to stick by them, rather than spamming tons of detachments to get loads and loads of command points, which you could certainly do with things like the Loyal 32, rules as written if you weren't playing by the organised play guidelines. Now though, it looks like they're very much baked into the core rules. At Combat Patrol you get 1 detachment, at Incursion you get 2, at Strike Force you get 3, and at Onslaught you get 4. It is kind of interesting that they're still limited like this, as now from the previous day's article on the command points, it looks like we're very much disincentivized to take more detachments now. With extra ones costing you additional command points, I think that people will generally be running less of them as a whole, but I suppose this still stops people going absolutely nuts and just going with something very silly like saying I don't want any command points, but every single unit in my army is going to be pretty much optimised with the best chapter tactics or whatever. I thought it was interesting at 500 points they're now only recommending 1 detachment for that. I believe it was 2 at less than 1,000 points as per the previous organised play rules, but to be honest at that sort of play level I think you're going to really struggle to go over 1 detachment size, unless you're really just trying to spam loads of just 1 cheap unit. They've also included some recommended play times for the games. Obviously we'll see how much this resembles reality once we have the edition. It seems fairly similar to what we have now to be honest, and unless they've added absolutely tons of rules bloat, I suspect games will probably be a little bit faster in 9th, if just because they look like they're raising the points cost just a little bit. So at 2,000 points for example you might have a few less models on the table than in 8th. We'll have to see if those 2 leaked points changes are particularly reflective of the general points rise, which they may not be. Next, and I'd say most interestingly from this update, is that Games Workshop is saying that you can play any of these game sizes on slightly smaller tables than before. They now specify a minimum size for the battlefield, rather than an exact recommended size, which I believe that they did again on the match play rules in 8th edition. If you want to, you can play your standard Strike Force 2,000 point game on a 44 inches by 60 inches board, rather than the more typical 48 inches by 72 inches that has been the norm for quite a while in 40k now. Of course there's absolutely nothing to stop you playing on whatever size board that you want to, but these are just their general rules for saying how the game is balanced. It's important to note that these are not mandatory and they're minimum sizes. It's certainly not a case of Games Workshop saying you must play on these smaller sized boards, get rid of your old ones or saw the edges off them or anything like that. And they specifically said in the article that these have been done to fit in with the Killzone boards that they released, which I understand are sold in 22 by 30 inch sizes. I think it's partly aimed to allow you to create any of these sizes of board with those same tiles, as well as the more standard Realm of Battle boards that Games Workshop already sells. Now playing on a smaller table certainly would change the game quite a lot to be honest. Naturally having a smaller board will generally allow more tables to be gaming tables, particularly at Combat Patrol or Incursion size. You might be able to fit official size games on a dining table now, rather than have it just be a little bit smaller than recommended size. I do think that it could have a really big impact on actual strength of units within the game though, which is interesting seeing as the points cost wouldn't change depending on what size board you're playing on. In general, if you've got less of a board to play on, then your army is going to have less space to run away into, and less room to deploy a long way back from your opponent's army and outrange them. I don't suspect it to be the absolute biggest change in the world. You'd still be setting up the same distance from each other and everything, but not having more backfield for each opponent certainly does reward and punish certain army builds. Things like extra long range artillery wouldn't be quite as relevant, just because a lot more regular guns are going to be in range anyway. Plus, gunline castles are generally going to be just that little bit closer to the enemy, meaning that they're a bit more under threat from closer range elements. And it's going to take less of a slog for assault armies to get into the core of the enemy army if the enemy is trying to hide as far back as possible. I don't think it would have an absolutely enormous impact on the game, but it would slightly reward some builds and slightly punish others. I'm interested to see as to how much this is going to get taken up by the community. I suspect at more casual levels we'll see a lot more of this, particularly with people who do play Kill Team and maybe have those board sizes around. I suspect at most gaming clubs and events they'll continue to use the 6x4 foot standard, just out of lack of interest in changing due to already having those board sizes available. Plus it's what people are already used to, and generally people don't like changing from playing with what they're used to. I do think it could be interesting to maybe have some sort of tournament or organised event on the smaller size boards though, just literally to try something new and see how it might impact the strongest armies in the game. Who knows, maybe we'd see a few more assault armies breaking through the meta. Next up we have combat patrol missions, an area that they say they've really tried to focus on this edition, as obviously it's one of the smaller sized games that you can play, so obviously having your first games as a more enjoyable experience is going to be a boon for people getting into the hobby. I think combat patrol is always going to be a little bit more swingy than some other game types, just because armies don't have all that many points to cover all of their weaknesses, and it can be quite easy to overwhelm your opponent with a certain type of build. Say taking 500 points of nothing but armour or nothing but infantry for example. I think it's more viable to do this at low point levels than at 2k if you were really trying to build the strongest possible 500 point army for some reason. They say below 500 points then things get even more silly and you're probably just best off playing kill team with your models until you build up to 500. Seems pretty reasonable to me. It'll be interesting to see if kill team adopts any of these new changes in 9th edition. For combat patrol we're getting 3 missions in the 9th edition rulebook. It turns out I was misinformed yesterday. There are 18 Eternal War missions in the big rulebook, which I'd theorise will be 3 for Combat Patrol, 6 for Incursion, 6 for Strike Force, and 3 for Onslaught. Naturally that's a bit of a guess, but I suspect they'd want to try and tailor missions and put more effort in for the game types that are more commonly played, which I do believe are around the 1000 to 2000 point level. They've also named these 3 Combat Patrol missions Incisive Attack, Outriders, and Encircle. Obviously that doesn't really give us much information, but they have shown off the mission Incisive Attack and what sort of objectives you'll be playing for. So Incisive Attack is an Eternal War mission, which does make me wonder if we're going to be seeing some updated Maelstrom missions in the new book as well. They really haven't talked about them much so far, and it makes me wonder how much of a thing tactical objectives are going to be. Basically this mission represents a clash in no man's land, as Outriders for 2 larger forces. This one's a bit of a hammer and anvil style deployment, with the 2 forces separated by 24 inches, each of them have one of their own objectives that's just 4 inches into their deployment zone, and there's 2 objectives 18 inches apart in no man's land. The primary objective is Take and Hold, which again is worded quite similarly to the previous mission that we've seen previewed. Basically 3 separate victory conditions. You get 5 points if you control 1 or more objective marker, you get a further 5 points if you control 2 or more, and if you control more objectives than your opponent then you get a further 5, and these objectives are scored at the end of your own command phase. So basically your opponent will have had a turn to try and knock you off these objectives, so they're more sort of defense type objective rather than ones that you can just jump straight into at the end of your turn. In addition there's a sweep and clear rule, which means that basically if you've controlled an objective marker until your opponent gets units on it then that objective marker is yours, even if your units move away to deal with the enemy. Now this one definitely looks like a rule they've tailored to combat patrol, because of course you're going to have less units at this point level, so having 1 or 2 of your units just sat around holding objectives is really quite a big deal, so it's quite nice to let them take an objective and then move on. And finally they have a secondary mission which is called Surgical Assault. This one's 5 points if you secure the objective marker in your opponent's deployment zone, and that happens at the end of your turn. So on the one hand obviously that's going to be the objective that's going to be hardest for you to get to, which it is scored at the end of your turn, so it is the sort of one that you can just zoom a unit up to steal, if you can blow away any defending forces that are on the objective. Overall, I think that this looks like a really well balanced and well designed little mission. I really like those 3 different ways to earn points. Holding 1, holding 2, and holding more than your opponent are 3 big levels of difficulty to get to, so it really seems to reward the player who's dominating the battlefield more, and the opponent will have their own turn to try and blow you off them with their own firepower. So still just wiping out the enemy can be a very valid solution. I think it's quite a nice touch that you can't score the primary objective in the first battle round as well, particularly as if that were the case then things like scouts or a bunch of nurglings will be even more powerful than they already are in these games, although it does help reward players who are happy to castle for a few turns and just wipe out the opponent's army before moving on to objectives, just because if you can't score points in the first round that means that the points are more weighted towards the end of the game. For me the secondary seems like a relatively hard one to do, but you can swap it out and pick others, much like the other mission that we saw. I'd be interested if you can pick just as many secondary missions even at a tiny combat patrol game as you can at a 2000 point strike force game, or maybe they'll have some sort of a scaling rule such as you can only pick 1 secondary in combat patrol and you maybe get 2 or 3 at strike force for example. Although I suppose you'll probably be able to do actions with your secondaries in the main mission pack. It's interesting that the secondary in this one doesn't have an action that's mandatory to achieve it. I think that would honestly be quite a big deal at Combat Patrol, just because if you're having a unit that's standing around doing nothing for a turn, at a 500 point game that's really quite a big deal. There's probably quite a big chunk of your army standing there doing nothing. Overall, everything I see about this one looks really good. I think it's a well designed mission for the points level, and certainly makes me hopeful for similar things at 2000 points. To be honest, I see no reason why this mission wouldn't work quite well as a big 2000 point game either. It seems pretty well thought to me, though I guess the objectives are a little bit close to the centre of the board, which looks like another thing that was intended for Combat Patrol and less units. So I'll be interested to hear what you think about the new changes. I think the detachments one was fairly predictable. I certainly didn't see the reduced table size coming though. I wonder how many people will be giving that a try, or just sticking to what they know. I'll certainly be looking forward to keeping up with the 9th edition news as Games Workshop releases it, so feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more. And if you have been watching regularly, then I'd just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page. Basically, it's the Patreon that allows me to spend quite so much time on making videos about model soldiers, as it's allowed me to take up less shifts at my regular real-time job. If you are enjoying regularly, then any support is greatly appreciated. As well as keeping new videos coming, Patrons get access to a few extra things, such as being able to see some videos early, regular votes on what sort of videos come next for the channel, and the occasional prize draw where I post out some miniatures to lucky patrons somewhere in the world. So if any of that sounds good, or you just like to help keep the videos coming, then the link is down in the video description below. A massive thank you to my current patrons for allowing this channel to happen. In any case, a very big thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.